Hello, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Lynn, and in this video, I'll be sharing with you my Easter flip project. What are flip projects? It's really just a collection of cards created in different styles that are centered around the same design motif. Now, the motif can be an occasion, a product like a stamp or die set, or even just a color palette. The first style of card is flat cards. While you can do a lot with a single layer card, I think of flat cards as being at most 2 layers. That would be your card base plus 1 layer of cardstock, no foam, and only low profile embellishments, if any at all. So that would include things that are relatively flat, like sequins, ribbon, twine, or your flat stickers, really anything that doesn't have a lot of dimension. Layered cards have 2 or more layers of cardstock, generally foam dimensionals or foam mounting tape, and embellishments that are more raised. That would include things like your pearl dots, resin or epoxy stickers, chipboard ephemerals, and any other type of embellishment that has a higher profile or thickness to it. Next are interactive cards. These are cards where the recipient can do something more than just open the card. So things like shaker cards and sliders are some of your more common cards, but there are a lot of different ways of creating interactive cards. And finally, pop-up cards. Now these are what I consider cards where all the action is on the inside. When you open the card, there's a 3D element or maybe a surprise. I actually consider some fun fold cards as pop-ups because they look like your typical A2 card on the outside, but then when you open it up, it reveals a lot more card. Now, a fully flipped project includes even more. The first edition is a paper-quilled design on the card. Now, if you're not familiar, paper quilling involves rolling, pinching, and shaping thin, long strips of paper into different shapes. And these shapes are then ultimately pieced together to make a larger image. Next, I often will customize envelopes to go with my cards. This can range from glamming up a pre-made store-bought envelope or making my own envelopes from scratch. And finally, the last set of cards revolves around turning discards into cards. If you're anything like me, at the end of a card making session, you have a lot of discards, which aren't always trash necessarily. For example, I do a lot of my die cutting and coloring up front, and I always try to make more than I need, which I seem to be pretty good at because I always have leftovers. There's also offcuts, trimmings, and other scraps that are generated along the way. At the end of my card making session, if there are enough discards, I try to turn those discards into as many cards as I can. The key is to use minimal additional supplies so you aren't generating even more scraps. To see an example of a flipped project, check out my Easter showcase. These are Easter cards I will be sending out to my family this year. Here are some of the flat cards that I made. I chose to use my laser printer and laminator to do some gold foiling of a Fabergé egg stock photo that I downloaded. I used Distress Oxide ink to color the first and water-based markers on the second, and you can actually just color right over the foil and then buff it clean again. And on the third, I used my Tombow multi-purpose glue to do additional foiling. These next cards are going to be my layered cards. So I've got a embossed background with dot pattern, and I actually used the same window frame die cut on all 3. On this one, I popped up those windows with some foam to give them a little extra dimension. And on this last one, I tucked the bunnies inside the window frame to give it a different look. This is the first interactive card in the set. It's a simple shaker card. There's some really flat round sequins. They're actually small. And then I die cut the letters and then put them with some colored cardstock behind. This is the Sizzix Flip It die set. It was actually the first time I used it, so pretty interesting. And that is an action wobbler. I love how the bunny ears stick up, so it's just inviting you to give it a little flick. The Flip It die, I actually made two, and the die is pretty nice because it not only cuts out the card base itself, but also those accent panels. So everything lines up perfectly. You have a nice even border around the edges, and that hello in the center is also cut from a die in the same set. And here's my pop-up card. I actually like to keep that outside of the card really simple so it seems nondescript, but then when you open it, you get the big surprise. And this basket I just wove with some thin strips of origami paper because I wanted to keep the inside as thin as possible. Kind of hides that surprise element of there being something inside. And then I tucked the bunnies in some more Fabergé eggs. What's important with this is because both the front and the back are visible, you want to make sure that you decorate the back as well. This is my favorite card. It's a paper-quilled bouquet of flowers, and I love it because even though I sketched out a design, the bouquet did evolve organically as I was creating it, which is something I love about paper quilling. It just kind of took on a life of its own. And there's really only a few different shapes, so it's fairly simple to make even if you've never paper quilled before. I wanted to keep the color centered in the bouquet, so I kept the embellishments simple and tone on tone with the ivory panel. The gold borders are from Love from Lizzie's peel-offs, and I just added a few pearl dots in the corners. And the sentiment I stamped inside, again, to keep the front simple. And so today I actually used store-bought envelopes that I'm going to customize to match my Easter cards. So I just used some pretty thin printed pattern paper, and these were just small sections of paper that were left over from my card making. And in some cases I used origami paper, which is also really thin too. And I find that the thin papers are really nice to use as envelope liners because they don't add any extra bulk. This is the first card of using my discards, and I really only had small scraps, so I used this cover die because it's perfect for when you do have a lot of those little scraps. I did have to cut the cover die out of a white panel, cardstock panel, and then I used the colored cardstock to inlay back into that white piece. So I love how it turned out because it kind of looks like a quilted pattern, and this one I love that it's got a different color palette altogether. Sometimes when I look at it I see cubes, and then sometimes when I look at it I see flowers. It's sort of an optical illusion. And I probably had more pieces to create a fourth card, but I didn't like the variation in colors after I had created that tone on tone one at the end, so I called it good. Now the extra bit of fun is when you get to sort of mix and match your cards with your custom envelopes. I definitely had a lot of fun making this set of cards, and it'll be fun to decide who gets which card. The two things that were new to me in this card making session were the Sizzix Flip It die. That was a first for me. I'd never used that before, and I like it. I think it'll be really fun to create more of those cards. Most of the time when I create my interactive cards, I design it in Photoshop and use my Cricut to cut it out. But the Flip It die does make things pretty quick, and it has all those accent pieces too, so I'll definitely be using it more. I'm also particularly proud of my paper-quilled bouquet. I've created bouquets before, but the rose design was a new technique for me, and I love how it turned out. I also figured out how to do the baby's breath with that little hint of green, and I didn't even have to look up paper-quilled examples, so I know it's a really simple design and probably not rocket science to figure out, but it's a baby step towards kind of using my, albeit limited, paper quilling knowledge to take a vision that's in my head and actually turn it into a paper quilt design. So I'm looking forward to expanding my skill set there. Overall, I like how my cards turned out, and I definitely had a lot of fun with this project. I actually have a few other projects in mind, and even some of them are at various stages of planning. So the next time I have an opportunity to sit down for a nice lengthy card making session, I will definitely turn the camera on and record a more tutorial style video to actually show you the card making process. Thank you so much for joining me for this Easter flipped project showcase. I hope you'll stay tuned for my next flip project video, and in the meantime, happy crafting!